Hey, welcome back to episode 75 of Warriors Den. Today's guest is BJJ Black Belt and Corrections Officer Rory van Vliet, who is a black belt under Island Top Team's Rob Biernacki, famous for the BJJconcepts.net and dick posts and whatnot. Colorful way of explaining conceptual jiu-jitsu. Rob is previously on the episode a long time ago. I'll put on the podcast. I'll put links for that in the episode description. And Rory can also be found at rvvbjj at youtube.com, and of course islandtopteam.com and bjjconcepts.net, and of course Rory has a healthcare control strategies and self-defense course. The link is a bit hard for me to go over right now, so I'll put that in the links as well. And that is specific for nursing and use of force for nursing in hospital settings, because he has a wealth of experience, and we talk about that. But first, let's talk about the sponsors, which is Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions, if you didn't know that from listening to this podcast. So, of course, if you like this podcast, the best ways to support us, if you're not local, is to go to UTKMblog.com and click on Support Us. And you can either just donate money if you like the content. It's awesome. I appreciate it. Of course, I understand that not everyone wants to just, hey, here's money. But I do appreciate it if you do. You can go to UTKMU.com, very much like BJJconcepts.net, except for Krav Maga. Though not as many videos, because I'm only one guy and I have lots to do. But UTKMU.com is the Urban Tactics Krav Maga curriculum. Right now is the beginner white belt and novice yellow and orange belt curriculum is up there. If you want to access that, there is a free section, though it's limited at the moment. I recently added basic firearm safety videos, though for free, as per the Canadian Firearm Safety and Restricted Courses, basic how to make it safe, so that is there. You can also, on the UTKMblog.com, you can click on the affiliate links. I did some products and books. I need to update it as I go, but things that I use personally, click on those affiliate links, and love that as well. Now, of course, if you're local and these restrictions go away, because we are still, it's 420 today, actually, didn't even think about it, still dealing with the shenanigans of COVID. So when this garbage ends, you can find us at urbantacticskm.com and sign up for a free trial class and learn Krav Maga as I teach it in the UTKM system, which is nothing special. It's just an organized, structured, conceptual-based system of techniques I learned throughout my Krav Maga journey. And we discuss in the podcast actually about the conceptual approaches. We prefer it and find it more useful in the long run. What else? Oh yeah, before I go into that tangent, Urban Tactics Krav Maga on Instagram, Urban Tactics Cam on Twitter, though don't really use Twitter because, censorship, and the Urban Tactics Krav Maga on Facebook. That's it for now for that. So yeah, back to our podcast guest, Rory. About 2 hours, so not a too long one. We had a very productive cost. And as it turns out today, Derek Chauvin was in what I suspect is the first of the second, because I suspect he was found guilty on all charges, which I don't agree on. The manslaughter one was the one that it's like, okay, maybe, yeah. But we discussed that because it's topical today. And we talk about use of force in policing. We talk about use of force in nursing. We talk about, at some point, we talk about conceptual teaching from jiu-jitsu. No politics on this one. So if you hate that stuff, you're lucky on this one. We didn't go in too much, but that's because Rory has a lot to say about the topics we covered, and I really wanted to get the perspective on use of force as someone who's in corrections, so we didn't talk too much about that for specific obvious reasons. He's an active person, but we talked about the hospital use of force in hospitals and nursing, and how it's complicated, and legalities. So if you're in security, or if you're in any job that requires use of force, policing, that this is probably a good one for you, as we discuss various ideologies on this topic. But other than if you want to support UTKM or Rory for that matter with his YouTube channel or on his nursing program for use of force, you can support us. Other than that, I guess here is a awesome podcast with Rory van Vliet, Island Top Team, BJJ Black. Krav Maga is not just a self-defense system, it is a way of life. Warriors Den is a podcast for Kravists, fighters, martial artists, warriors, politicians, and general citizens. Consider this. The society that separates scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Lucidity. Your host, Jonathan Fader, talks to guests in an open and uncensored format about their fights, their philosophies, and their lives. No topic is taboo, and the conversation may start in one place and end in another. As the quote suggests, you cannot separate the warrior from the politics and the world around them, as a true warrior must be a student in all forms of art and science.
You're listening to The Warriors Day. Brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions.
Okay, welcome back. I am here with the expert in taint sweeps and dick posts, Rory van Vliet. Local people in Vancouver will know what I'm talking about, but for everyone else, let's start with your martial arts background, Rory.
Hey, so I started in German Jiu-Jitsu when I was around 19, so 12 years ago, which is basically just Japanese Jiu-Jitsu with some kickboxing to it. And we were also practicing submission grappling, so the no-gi stuff on the ground. And I found that I naturally started to gravitate towards that. And with working in a security force and stuff like that, I ended up always resorting to grappling. And so I wanted to try and focus more on that. And so I moved over to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu completely. And unfortunately, my instructor, Rob Biernacki, the founder of taint sweeps and dick posts and other awful terminology, I got to start training with him about 8 years ago or so. I don't know. It's kind of a blur at this point. It's been so long.
Yeah.
And so I got my black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under him. And no looking back. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu all the way.
Yeah. Well, what would be some significant differences? Because like if I say German Jiu-Jitsu, like nobody's gonna know. It was like really.
So yeah, that's where, like I said, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. So it's like we did lots of the bullshit stand-up wrist locks and stuff like that. The self-defense scenarios, that some realistic, some just not going to be like how stuff plays out, where like you're practicing the stuff like when someone grabs your shirt but just stands your stationary and isn't throwing a punch, I'm going to do this awesome Aikido wrist lock takedown from here, and it's just like that doesn't really fly. So there's a bunch of stuff like that, and I was super into it. Like I drank that Kool-Aid and was practicing like lock flows and stuff. Like I still know all these different wrist locks that are fancy from standing and different shoulder locks and stuff. But then when I started doing loss prevention is what I first started with in the security field. So I would pretend to shop at a grocery store in plain clothes, and I would just hunt people down and catch people when they steal.
To hunt a predator.
Yeah, basically. And so I would occasionally, when I'm arresting somebody, have to use force to capture them because they obviously don't want to be there. They want to run. And so it always just ended up, whether it was me chasing people down and having to drag them to the ground, in which then we'd go into takedowns in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or even when people stood their ground and tried to throw like a strike or something back at me, while the German Jiu-Jitsu self-defense stuff helped me in the sense of being able to close that distance and block some strikes, which traditional, like if you're doing sport orientated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're probably not practicing that stuff. It helped me in that sense, but I still found myself always closing the distance and just grabbing people, whether it's just like body lock, hugging them. It could be ugly as shit because I was a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time. Like I was a brown belt in German Jiu-Jitsu, but the curriculum wasn't tested towards any of the ground stuff. And so, but I was just naturally better than the average Joe, as anyone with even a few months of experience in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And because of that,
quite tall and lanky, that helped.
That too. And just because of the sparring aspect of it, which is really what differentiates, say, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from German Jiu-Jitsu or the other like stand-up, more self-defense orientated Jiu-Jitsus, is that we get to spar it. And so while stuff still sucked and I was still a white belt, I was able to, against resisting people, feel more comfortable taking them down because I was used to sparring my training partners at the gym. And so I'd constantly just drag them down to the ground, and also work really nicely for like within a use of force aspect, not to hurt people. And I could just control guys until they either completely gave up and would just actually sit there next to me until like the cops arrived, or sometimes I'd have to stay in full mount or side control, back control until the cops arrived and could take over for me because I was always by myself.
Yeah.
And so I started to, and I tried these wrist locks. I tried the straight armbar takedown and stuff like that. And we also did security for music events. So I'd be holding the front line at the stage and have to take people down when they rush to try and jump on the stage to dance. Nothing, no malice behind like their intent or anything like that, but just drunk people being idiots. And I still could not make this shit work, even though I was practicing it like 30 hours a week. And I loved it. I was so entrenched in it. But I kept resorting to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the grappling, because as I found, it was more legitimate technique, as well as that sparring element is the thing that takes you to that next level. And it's really hard unless like, and I'm sure like we've talked about this stuff kind of before when we've trained together and whatnot, where like with the Krav Maga and stuff, when you want to go like that level, it's like you got to wear like next levels of training, protective gear and stuff like that. Because if you want to actually be able to replicate somebody actually grabbing you and starting to try and take you down, and you want to be able to throw these strikes and still have training partners to practice with, it's like you got to elevate it to such a level that's just usually not able to be replicated with just the average Joes that want to be training some self-defense and have the idea that they are able to defend themselves in a street fight. And it's harder on the body too.
I mean, that for me is with beginners is one of the hardest things to get into their head. It's like, listen, like we can't go full force with this stuff because somebody is going to get hurt. And it's a lot of times it's me because I'm the smallest one there. Like, I don't like doing privates all the time. If it's always like guys your size, I'm like, I just get up. And it's hard for people to understand. Luckily, sports psychology is there and says, hey, if you mimic it reasonably and train nervous system responses, it actually translates into the real world. But getting the average person who's been watching YouTube all day on Krav Maga to understand that, and they just want to go hard all the time. I don't like to go too hard with beginners until I know I'm comfortable with them and what they can and cannot do. And then I'm like, oh yeah, you can go. But it's a hard thing to train. And then you actually need to get that many more iterations versus like jujitsu, because you can safely get the iterations in on a consistent basis.
White belts are still dangerous for like being spazzes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, obviously. But just the nature of taking two bodies and putting them on the ground creates more stability and creates an easier time to control the momentum of each other, because that's the other problem when you're doing all the stand-up stuff, is that even if we just look at a wrestling or judo background, the throws, the weight transference of, say, you and me grappling each other and taking each other down, where you got two full-grown men barreling down to the ground, and if you post your leg the wrong way, if you post your arm the wrong way, catastrophic injury happens. And those are going to be usually safer takedowns too, in the sense where you're dropping somebody down to like their butt or their back usually. Where if we look at some of the takedowns, like a straight armbar takedown, which I fucking hate, but it's what's taught for use of force and like our go-to move within law enforcement.
Could you explain that specific takedown so maybe people listening?
Yeah, so you're standing beside your opponent and controlling their arm, and whether you know what a Russian tie looks like, which is kind of like a better form of control, but you're controlling them from like this escort position. Like imagine a bouncer walking somebody out of the bar beside them. You're holding one of their arms out around the elbow and around the wrist and walking beside them. And then when they start to resist, you're taking your near arm, applying pressure to the back of their elbow to create that hyperextension, and magically pushing them down towards the ground into a prone position face down. And theoretically, then the arm is really easy to bring behind their back for handcuffing procedures. There's a bunch of little reasons why people like teaching it within law enforcement, because it can be a nice, tidy package if it works really well. But at the same time, when you have to use like a high level of force to drive somebody down, you're driving them literally down onto their face. And it's not hard to look at videos of excessive force and stuff like that, where you see a cop take down, say, a woman in the one example I'm looking at, like it was within the detachment, I think, and he slammed her right down onto her face in the concrete. Her teeth got knocked out. There's blood everywhere from her nose and whatever else got split open.
Yeah.
And so it's like, man, like either the technique fails and the guy's going to turn into you immediately, or woman, or you pull it off. But because you have to use such a high level of intensity to do it, they're going to be landing in a way that, one, we can't break fall very safely if we're looking within the training environment, like we were just talking about. But then even when we're using this in a real life situation, it's like, man, I'm going to wreck somebody.
Yeah.
And I might be within the bounds of reasonable force, and I might be able to argue that in court, but I still probably have to deal with the litigation behind that and actually deal with possibly being charged and having to actually go to court. And even if I am found innocent, it's like, man, that still probably took a year off my life.
Yep.
Being tied up in that, let alone the stress of that,
Yeah.
which is terrifying because you never know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting because, like, obviously a lot of my Krav instructors are Israeli, and the legal thing is like a disconnect from people in Europe or other places where they have a lot more authority to engage violently as an officer or security. And so, like, that take you're talking about, the way I've been taught, they do it from the shoulder. Now, in my curriculum, it's not a beginner thing at all. I'm like, hey, if you can feel that you can do it safely, by all means. But the thing I've been told is like, oh, they'll always break fall. And I'm like, no, they won't. Half the time they land on their arm and whatever. And I prefer these other takedowns that do sometimes require a little bit of striking, but you're controlling the head at all times. Now, if I'm teaching security or police, I'm going to take the striking out and show the modified versions. But I think consistently, when the legal constraints come in North America, as we're seeing it's getting a little nuts, is that striking is not an option anymore at all. And
which is too bad, because we're actually having legitimate tools being taken away. Same like the George Floyd case, like Derek Chauvin just got found guilty. Yeah. And I mean, he fucked up and it was absolutely stupid. But now there's like the idea, like, I think in some states, I can't remember if they've even passed it yet, or they're looking at passing legislation that if any chokehold was ever applied in the altercation by a cop, that even if they didn't have the intent of harming somebody, they could be criminally charged just for applying it, just for having something wrapped around the guy's neck for a moment, like whether it was like a front headlock, guillotine control, or something like that. And now it becomes like this. Now we're taking away the mens rea within the Canadian legal system, where we're talking about the guilty mind, where it's like, even if they weren't intending to choke somebody and they just, on camera, you can see them wrapping around in some way when shit hits the fan, because once adrenaline dumps and you're fearing for your life, it's like, holy crap. Even for me as a black belt, it's like, I might just all of a sudden resort right to one of the techniques that I know very well, that I use in sparring all the time. Yeah. That might be a choke for a second. I'll be like, holy crap, I need to let that up for a second. But now I have to be scared that if I resort to that, I could even be criminally charged, which then is going to make it more likely for me to probably just stand back. And obviously we always want to be verbally de-escalating, but I might be more inclined to just start cranking out intermediary weapons, where it's like, I'd rather just be seen pepper spraying the guy or tasering the guy immediately, rather than risking possibly applying a chokehold for a second, which is safe. But if you tell somebody that choking somebody for a moment is a great way of being able to sometimes de-escalate the situation, ignorant people are not going to do that. But I know in bouncing, as long as I was also off camera, I rear naked choked the shit out of people sometimes. I would sit them down on their butt, because the takedowns I liked was usually breaking somebody's legs down backwards and making them sit to their butt, because even if we land hard, butt's a pretty nice cushion. Worst case scenario, they bruise themselves a little bit. But then from there, I'm able to control them. I'm able to scan the room if I needed to, just apply a little bit of pressure around their neck and make them kind of realize, like, oh, I'm pretty screwed here. Then I found guys would calm down at that point. I never choked people unconscious, but there's never a mark on them. I usually had guys thank me the next day, because there would always be these regular patrons that would come in Thursday, Friday, and Saturday and just get sloshed out of their minds. I hate alcohol in that whole system, but that's just how it worked. And I even had like one guy, I think, complain to the cops or to my boss about me applying a choke once, but there wasn't a single mark on him.
Yeah.
And he was, there was no damage to him. But as a trained individual, I apply it quickly and methodically, and I let go immediately. I don't hold it for 9 minutes and 39 seconds or whatever
I can
this
get into
was.
that too. It's I actually am interested in your thoughts, like
Yeah.
because it's a very like you brought it up. So I'm like and if anyone listening, they literally just announced the guilty verdict like an hour ago. I missed out on an afternoon nap because I'm like waiting for it, and I'm a bit appalled at guilty on all charges. But from let's talk about the video itself. What was your assessment on it?
Well, so like I haven't watched the video for a bit, but I was watching some of the court proceedings and them talking about where it's like you got this guy that, however they ended up on the ground, we had the victim George Floyd that was handcuffed and he was compliant at that point,
Yeah.
and yet the guy was still sitting with his shin and a bunch of weight into the back of his neck. And so I can't remember if they had talked about where it was like positional asphyxiation or how much actual of like the choke or strangulation was being applied by the shin. Like that stuff's not the part that's super important to me. But at that point, like I I have no problem once again within a moment, even though like I'm not allowed to at work and other agencies are doing the same thing where it's like if your knee is seen dropped on the back of somebody's spine at any point, whether it's lower at the hips, which is perfectly safe, kind of just like knee on belly, but somebody who's in a prone position, upwards to the shoulders, where yeah, we are starting to actually put pressure on the lungs, and we're going to make it more likely that they would positionally asphyxiate. And then upwards to the neck, which even if once again it choked them for a second or two, it's safe enough. But sitting there for
Right.
minutes at a time is dumb. Now, the real problem was that he wasn't resisting anymore at that point. He was handcuffed. Get off the guy and just kneel beside him, and you can still control the rotation of his body. So, like, this is where like the biggest divide comes, and where people, including law enforcement, couldn't stand beside him anymore. Where it's like, I don't know what the takedown was like and what that was all happening. It seemed pretty polite and cooperative at first when they were first talking to the victim through like the window of his car and helping him out.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that had
20-minute video then, like
yeah. So it had escalated at some point and they took him down. But it's like, man, once you got the handcuffs on, like, and he wasn't responding, or at one, unfortunately, he wasn't even moving because he was completely unconscious or dead at whatever point that occurred. And yet they still just sat there. And I know, like, once again, with adrenaline and you're worried about the public and stuff, like, it's such a tough situation for law enforcement officers to make the right call in these moments. But 9 minutes and 39 seconds or whatever the actual time was, it was just way too much that once the guy's handcuffed, they can't fight back very much at all anymore. Even them trying to get to a standing position, if you were to let go of them completely, really bloody difficult. Back off, kneel beside him, still be able to control him with your arms, be able to hold on to the handcuffs to apply like a bit of torque in there, whether it's pain compliance or what. You just did not have to be sitting there on the neck for so long. Whether like I'm not talking about like the intention of killing the guy, but unfortunately, he made wrong calls, which then did lead to the death of somebody.
I mean, that seems to be the consensus. It's like, given the circumstances, he didn't need to be there on for that long. But like, my story I always tell is, you know, I was at a party. This is way long ago, and I was drinking because I'm just at a party. But the host's girlfriend, who must have been like 90 pounds, for some stupid ass reason, this was the night she decided to break her sober streak of years. And you can imagine how that went. Now, not my party, not my thing. And I'm like, I don't like to get involved in stuff unless I absolutely have to. One, because again, I'm a smaller guy and I don't like taking that risk if I don't need to. But it got to the point where after she stormed off, came back, started smashing bottles on people, I'm like, okay. And I somehow ended up, I like to pretend it was a graceful thing, but it probably was not. But I ended up with my shin on her neck, the side of the neck. Now, I never teach it on the back of the neck, but the carotid with the shin. And I was on her for 20 minutes. So my argument is I was drunk. She's way lighter than me. What would happen is she'd start trying to swing. I press a little bit. She'd go out and she'd start snoring. So I'd lift up. And then she'd start swinging and I'd push down and she'd go out and wake up. 20 minutes, no problem. And what I see is in the George Floyd case was that he wasn't resisting at that point, so he probably should not have been on his back for that long. But this argument that the public and a lot of people are making, that you taking these tools away that are sometimes necessary, is a little insane. Now, you and I will probably both agree that, let's say, jujitsu as a purple belt, you should have enough skill to realize this person should be tapping right now, and they're not, right? And you let go. And you know, even though he was a police veteran, I just don't believe they get sufficient training to the point where he can really have that feel to be like, okay, this person's not responding. Even like, you know, the micro feelings you get, like, oh, they should be tapping, or why isn't he moving or saying anything? Now, I don't think he should have been charged with murder, manslaughter, maybe, but murder. And it's like, what do cops do nowadays? They're not getting the training. There's a lot of hate, and they're in a lose-lose situation, no matter what. And I see use of force experts railing on him outright. I'm like, listen, there's some nuance to this case, and if you're pretending it's only a racial issue, or you're pretending that there's no nuance, I'm just like, we're not having meaningful conversations about use of force anymore, and everyone's just sort of like standing on their sides, and it's like, I don't know what to think about it anymore, you know?
Yeah, it's a tough situation. And like I said, even though I used the rear naked choke at work sometimes when I was bouncing, I never put somebody out, and I would never apply that much pressure. Like if it was within the means, in the sense that I had to protect myself, then absolutely I would. But I didn't see the need to do that. I can't speak for your situation like that, but like the more we start cutting off the blood to the brain repeatedly and stuff like that, then we could argue that there's going to be different levels of risk. And like, it seems, unfortunately, that some people, there's been more cases just in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of people experiencing strokes, whether or not that is completely linked to just strangulation, where we are cutting blood off to the brain, or there's other health complications in there. We can agree that it's not good to be cutting blood off to the brain a whole bunch. So I would prefer to not put someone to sleep, but in the circumstances you might have to. But with like that case, like I can't speak on it and say that it is definitely a race issue, because once again, like as like we looked at the video at the beginning, it looked like they were trying to be quite polite with them, instead of like what I would first see as like complete racist behavior from officers. But definitely a lack of training.
Yeah.
That, as you talked about, where it's like the people just don't know what the hell they're doing. There could be like, because I think it was with Chauvin, like he had a whole bunch of other complaints and other issues with him there. So like integrity as a person, or like how he is as an officer, like those possibly were already in question. But yeah, training for officers, like usually with RCMP corrections, at least here in like BC, every few years we get 1 day of training to kind of go over the force options that we had spent a week to several weeks doing at the very beginning before we got into the workforce. But now it's all going to be crunched into 1 day. We just quickly rip through these techniques that people have not practiced for years. And now we're just kind of putting like a Band-Aid on, being like, oh yeah, okay, now you've gone through the techniques today. You're good now. We can revisit this in 3 years. And so you and I both know it's like, that's not how this fucking works. If I don't train something for like a week in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, even if I'm training like other areas, so like I'm still grappling, I'm training my guard passing, I'm training my positional control and stuff like that. And then if it's been like a week or two and I haven't touched guard retention or meaningfully thought about it, then I might even notice myself. I'm like, all right, guard retention has started to slip a little bit. I need to get back to that, and I need to try and bring that back up. And that's me constantly training and thinking about it. Taking years off and not doing this stuff is
crazy.
It's crazy. And then once again, there becomes the argument of what is actual practical use of force techniques, where training stuff like, for me, like the straight armbar takedown or some of the wrist locks that we practice, it's like, can it be done? Yes. Does it have a high probability of success? No, I don't think it's fundamentally sound either. And the idea of having, like, say, a small 5'2" woman that weighs like 100 pounds to try and take down a large man, which unfortunately men are usually the more violent offenders, it's just not going to work. Because like I've used the straight armbar takedown on people that are drunk, that are almost falling over themselves. So that's not a very good measurement for success. And I've used it on women, unfortunately, where like they'll try and scratch a lot more or bite when you tell them they have to leave the bar, and then they tell you fuck off, they throw their drink at you, and then it's like, okay, I'll grab their arm, and because I'm so much stronger, I'm even able to hold their arm extended further away from me, where this is not technically good technique, but because of the physical advantage that I have, I'm able to keep myself safe and hold her out. And then if it escalated, I can even take her down somewhat more gently, because I can just kind of slowly push her down to the ground so that then the cops can take over. But the times that I've tried to control a grown man by their arm, it's just like, oh my God, they tense up, and I'm just unable to make anything happen off of that. And so once again, letting go of the arms and moving into controlling more of like the hips, the spine, the head, the legs, and going into more traditional wrestling or judo takedowns was much more successful. So like, yeah, there needs to be a revamping of what is actually taught, and then also more frequency, whether it's them spending money to make sure that people are actually training jiu-jitsu at other clubs regularly, or getting more in-house training with Brazilian jiu-jitsu or other stuff. Because like my boxing and Muay Thai experience from years ago has really helped me with feeling more confident avoiding punches and being able to close that distance, because that's another part. There's all these different ranges of fighting, as I'm sure you've talked about in like other podcasts episodes. So it's the idea of taking money away from the police, which was like the first big thing where like people went as far as saying like defund the police. I think that would cause more issues. If anything, we just need to, we need to look at actually how do we revamp the allocation of funds within policing, and possibly even throw more at it to be like, these people are at the front lines and they're just not adequately trained. And that's the main reason why we're seeing issues.
I mean, we're lucky in Canada. It's a little better, but I mean, as we discussed, it's not great. But you know, sometimes I wonder about like the policies too, not even use of force, because like let's say, barring a weapon being involved in a roadside stop, usually police here just let them go, and they like, we got our license, we got their thing, and they just knock on their door later. Versus it seems like the policy in the States, it's always like, it's go time now, you know. So I don't know what that's like, what's going on there, but it seems like that approach of the Canadians is it reduces the violence. Unless they pull out a gun or a knife, then that's a different story, of course.
Yeah, there's policy, and then there is just the legit problem of ego, where like that is usually what people freak out the most about. And we're like, I never get sick of watching, just like it's addicting to watch chaos and horrible things happen, where you just watch like the police pullovers where whether regardless of the race or gender of the person that got pulled over, it's like you'll just see these cops just start to say the dumbest things or act so authoritarian, and you're just like, man, there's a problem of ego here. And while we can say that there's a training issue with that as well, there's some people that's just like, one, maybe they shouldn't be cops, or two, like we got to have better check-ins or checks and balances to make sure that we can keep those people held in line or sift them out earlier, or like
hard.
Yeah, it's tough because when you put on the uniform, it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like I feel like at an elevated status, and obviously you are granted more powers, and so it's like you got to have, just like when you see that person that gets promoted to any other higher position, regardless of the field you're in, usually when people start to become bosses or in charge of other people, we start to see them become shittier people. And it's just like such a joke commonly that's like, oh, I hate my boss, or I hate my boss for these reasons. And it's like, that's because people are just granted power, and then ego starts to cloud judgment and make you feel like you're infallible. And there needs to be like better training and awareness to be like, hey, we got to have these conversations that now that Becky has been promoted to the store manager of produce, that we should also check in and make sure that you're not going to be like power tripping off of this, and making sure that you're still being held accountable to that.
And then, well, in policing specifically, as they climb up the ladder, they often become more politicians than they do officers. And that's, to me, it's like, how do you rectify that when you get to a certain point? It's in order to progress, you got to play these silly games that actually have nothing to do with the general health and well-being of the public. And it's like, I wouldn't want to do it. Like if I was a cop in the States now, I'd be like, I'm out, I'm done.
Well, we saw a higher rate of people retiring at that point, and some of those were probably really good officers. And then you're going to have other people that are like, if we're looking at the cream of the crop, the people that you want to have in these powerful positions, they're going to have other options too. And so you have to have policing be enticing, where it pays well and people respect you and stuff. Like we used to have this idea of police, even say like 20 years ago. Now, obviously, as a kid, I was just fantasizing about like maybe being a police officer one day, and it might not I mean, they would have been more respected than they are right now, because police are definitely getting shit on harder than ever right now. But it's just like, why would I want to put myself through that when it's like, if I have a university education, or if I'm pretty smart and I have options to go to other lines of work, those people are going to do that. And so then we end up just getting a lower level of candidate applying for policing, whether it's in the States, especially right now, but it could also be the same in Canada. And so then you got shittier people being put in these positions, which then, as we talked about, comes back around where it's like, does the training really, is it going to make that much of a difference at this point? Because some of these people, such aggression when even just pulling somebody over for a routine traffic stop, or like there's that the thing that was just kind of going on where they pulled over that guy that pulled over at the gas station that was in the military in the States.
I haven't actually seen that video yet, but it's an
and so that's another interesting one where it's like, you're watching how the cops are acting, and it's like, man, like I don't know how much training would have like corrected that situation. And it's like, you did have this guy that he kept driving, I think, for like another mile or something like that to get to a safe place to pull over once the cop had the lights on. So now the cops are coming in a more escalated state there because he wasn't following direction immediately. But at the same time, the guy was so polite and had his hands up the whole time, and he's just asking some questions about what he did wrong. And the cops just continually kept on escalating, and then pepper spraying him, which he wasn't even like doing anything to escalate that level of force in the car. And and some other things said from officers were like, the guy said, I feel afraid to step out of the car right now. And then the cop's like, well, you should be afraid. And it's like, well, okay, that's not going to get a level of compliance from the person that you're trying to apprehend right now. So, I mean, it's always, and it's something that we spend more time in corrections as well as I'm imagining with all the other agencies, is like, we're continually coming back to talking about communication and getting better at that, and trauma-informed practices and de-escalation tactics, and spending this time where it's like, I've exhausted all my options. And that was something that I also felt very confident that when I'm using force on those guys, where like I take them down at the bar, or I walk them out, or I have to, for whatever reason, escalate the force, I usually spent 3 to 10 minutes talking to the person, trying to get them to walk out first, because I gotta get them to pay their bill. And like, that's super important, especially like they're in like in a business. And then some guys were at like the back of the bar, and we have a capacity of 285 people, and it's like, I gotta try and walk this guy out through, or fight with this guy out past all these people, chairs and tables. It doesn't matter that I'm a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like this could go sideways really quickly. And it has, where I've been punched a whole bunch of times from people at all angles, where I'm getting jumped essentially, where it's like, training against multiple people is like good fucking luck. Like if they run at you enough in a straight line, you can take people out quickly. Theoretically it can work, but man, when it goes sideways, it just becomes about survival.
That's my because we teach it a little bit, but it's like, you're basically covering up and getting out. And then I look at it as, you have two types of multi-attacker situations. You have the sort of lazy, like, don't really know what they're doing guys, and then you have the swarm mentality. And I've seen people get swarmed, and it's like, you got a couple seconds to get out, or you're fighting for your life.
I just kept my head down. I covered my face, like trying to just protect my temple and chin so that I don't get knocked unconscious and drop to the ground, because then I'd be getting stomped. And fortunately, because I had backup in the area, because I had usually three of us working at one time for security, I just basically kept my head down, was like, Stathy and Jesse will get here shortly, I hope. I'm just going to take a beating. And so the top of my head was bruised and covered with lumps the next day. I had some stitches I had to get from the initial sucker punch, but I stayed there and was able to just take a beating until backup arrived. And obviously, if that's within a workforce, if you don't have backup, then man, like, good luck to you. That's a
huge issue. I have big issues with the whole RCMP's policy of one person per car now, and I say it's to do with de-escalation tactics, but I'm like, no, it's because you're cheap and don't hire more officers. You know, they're
budgeting and all the politics behind that stuff also affects the job.
It was like one of my students who's taking crim was telling me it's because they did a study that said it means they're less likely to get aggressive. And I'm like, I completely understand that, as in, if you got your buddy standing right there, you feel more comfortable doing it. But at the same time, I'm like, you're actually putting everyone more at risk, in my opinion. It's like, okay, what if it goes sideways and they're by themselves? And if they do need to engage, having two people there is going to be easier to handle it than one. But of course, if none of them have good training, then it's going to be crap no matter what you do. So
yeah, it's difficult because like there it's such an open area. So when you see even multiple cop cars pull up, let alone 20 sometimes, that can certainly escalate a situation. Unfortunately, like say in corrections or when I worked at the hospital, or it's like we have rooms and hallways and stuff. So there'll be times where I'm dealing with a patient or an inmate that is starting to escalate, and I can have my partner covering me, but he's behind the door out of view. Maybe he's going to be in there helping me talk because two people is usually fine, but I might have 5 people on the other side of the door waiting, just waiting in case something goes wrong. And so that helps me be able to have that conversation with the guy and know that if shit escalates further, I got backup. But at the same time, this guy feels a little more comfortable because he's talking to just Rory and maybe somebody else, and doesn't have like a whole bunch of people crowding around him and wearing the gloves or even having the baton or the pepper spray out and stuff like that. Like it's such a tough thing because you do have like this mixture of like it escalates, but similar for police, they're not going to have backups so nearby. And obviously there's so many more variables where like in a jail setting, we have pretty good control over making sure that these guys don't have weapons and drugs.
yeah,
Certain things happen, but they're not going to have a gun. Like that never happens. But when you do a routine pullover, that guy might have a gun on him. And it's like, man, I couldn't imagine the constant stress of being in that hypervigilant state, because every single pullover that you do could theoretically be the last one, and you don't know anything about the, like any inmate or patient that I would work with, I know their entire history beforehand if I want to. I probably already have a relationship developed with this guy, but if I don't, somebody else nearby probably does. And like I said, it's like odds are they're totally sober. If they did get their hands on drugs or alcohol in some way, it's going to be within a limited factor. And then there might be like some sort of shank kind of situation. It's rare, but still it could happen. But something like a gun, or I mean, Christ, you could be dealing with explosives as police officers. Like, it's there's so many issues and things that you have to be trained for, and you get trained so little, and then the public shits on you. It's a miracle that anybody wants to be a cop right now.
I don't think that's fair of the public to be like, you must know their entire medical history. It's like, it's not, I don't believe it's a responsibility of a police officer to take into account that they have medical conditions that you could not possibly know about unless they have like a medical alert bracelet or they're on crutches or something. But that seems to be the public standard that these cops must know because of this. Why you should know he has a heart disease issue. And it's like, no, I shouldn't. Like, they're being aggressive, and that's what I'm working off of if I was to be a cop.
Yeah, unless they straight up tell you it, and if it's something that you can kind of try and factor in, great. I know there's some people saying like, hey, if you take down a patient or a suspect and they start yelling that they can't breathe, you should have to let go of them and back away. And it's like, well, no, that's a problem too, because now people that don't have the issue will also say that just to know that you have to back away. I can reasonably stay next to this person, take weight off of their chest or however we're positioned from side control or mount or whatnot. If I'm trained, I know how I can lift myself off to be able to give them the room to be able to get air. And then if we're dealing with something with like a claustrophobia or whatnot, where the person is still going to be panicking anyway, we're going to have to work with that. And unfortunately, sometimes they're going to have to be in an uncomfortable situation that is scary for a bit. And if the officers are properly trained and have empathy and stuff like that, hopefully they can work with the patient or the suspect that they're apprehending through that. Because I think it's definitely, as we talked about with communication, it's important for the officers to understand a bit more about like the mental health and the different things that could be happening to that person and being able to talk them through. It's like getting pepper sprayed yourself in training, so that then it's like, okay, I have an understanding of how this feels. And so when I have confidence in in this weapon when I use it, but at the same time, if I pepper spray somebody, I'm going to hopefully be able to talk them through it. I'll be able to kind of recite some of the symptoms that they're feeling at that time and help them calm down a bit if they're starting to freak out. And so the same thing.
And I'll just be like, let's go, motherfucker.
Yeah. Versus, where you see it's like once you start to escalate that force and the adrenaline starts going and everything starts to go to hell real quick. People can have more fun with that than they really should be. The egos, the authority behind that.
Peppers, but like I've, the military grade tier, which to me is like, As long as you don't deep inhale, I'm like, I can.
Man, I inhaled some tear gas last month and it was awful.
Brutal.
Like that was such a sharp sensation of everything burning and seizing up where I was like, I'm gonna die. And I had to like roll out of the smoke where like pepper spray was like really uncomfortable. It was just like having the hottest wings being rubbed all on your face. And it's like it's just constant and lasts longer. But like the tear gas for like 5 seconds, I was like, holy shit. And then you roll out of it and then you're fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't last. So it's interesting to see those. Yeah. Well, I had my mask on, but I had my bangs over underneath the mask because I'm an idiot. So I'm sitting over top of this tear gas deploying and just breathing just to test my mask out. And the damn thing came all through my eyes and was burning my skin. And then I took a big breath and woo.
Yeah.
It was a cool experience to at least like feel what that's like. Because once again, I'll know what somebody might be going through if we ever had to use that.
Short, quick breaths. Keep your eyes open. Just like so you get the oxygen, but you don't really like get it in your lungs.
Yeah. Now I just need to get tased. I haven't got tased yet. I want to see what that's like.
I've never been tased. I don't really want to. I've heard just like I don't know anybody who's like, let's do that again, except maybe the jackass guys. Like,
yeah, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to do it again. But I want to experience it at least once to say that I did. And I am still young and dumb enough that part of me is like, yeah, that'd be kind of a fun story to see. And I know people that are like, I would rather get tasered again than get fully pepper sprayed again.
Really, I don't know about that. It's
pepper spray fucked me up.
I did it
for like an hour. I struggled, and then I finally got my face and eyes cleared out, but I had some in my hair. So then after the day of training, I went home and I showered, and then I washed it back into my eyes, and I'm just screaming in the shower. And my roommate at the time is just like, "What's going on?" And it's like, "Oh, it's pepper spray."
Yeah,
so it's just like a lasting thing.
It was actually, I got, unfortunately, you know, teenager, you make friends with the wrong people, things go sideways, and I got bear maced like pretty close, and that was my first experience. But that's where I learned, like, oh, you can fight through that, because they are actually on my house property, and I was pissed. And so I don't want to get into the details, but my parents were around, and I got bear maced. I basically sprinted right after them, and I'm like, I don't understand, like, because I couldn't see properly, but I can't imagine someone being able to run that fast where they just bear mace someone, and I'm just with rage sprinting after these people, and they were gone. They must have had like a getaway car, and they're like, oh shit, this guy's crazy.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't knock you down like something like, say, tear gas or a taser would, like, because we did you get a little bit of the pepper spray, and then we still did like some pad work with the batons where we were hitting pads. So it's like you're forced to look, and you can still see the target, and you got to fight through it. I know cops do a similar thing where they get pepper sprayed and then they have to do certain like obstacles and shit like that. So it's like, it won't knock you down. It certainly like will put you at a disadvantage, but and I know some guys that can eat that stuff like, problem.
Yeah. Now I wanted to go back because we were talking about like sort of de-escalation tactics. Now me, I find that the hardest thing to do, and it's like, you know, I have my personal issues and quirks that make it harder for me, but it's like if it's already hard enough for police or security or anyone to learn the actual physical use of force, which you need to practice, it's the same for the de-escalation. And while you certainly, like with de-escalation and speaking, it's like, it's a part of it that it's actually harder to train for a lot of people, because, you know, you meet these guys that are just got the gift of gab, and they can talk anyone down in their voice tone, because you got to think about
that's me.
This, like, I'm horrible at that. I have a tendency to constantly aggravate.
I can talk forever, and I can be the guy for the investigations as well as de-escalation.
It's a skill, and
it's like another skill, and that's the thing. So then it becomes, one, what is the techniques being taught? Because there's a lot of crappy communication training going on where it's very vague, and it's like, hey, you want to, like, there's some good tips where it's like, you want to lower your voice. You're not trying to match their volume. If they're escalating, you want to have that grounding point for them to come back to. Talk more slowly, talk about eye contact, talking about not having threatening body language where it's like, hey man, I want you to calm down. You got your fists up the whole time, where it's like, okay, well, that's not congruent to what you're trying to say.
Don't tell them to calm down.
Don't say stop or calm down. So it's like, that's usually about as far as it goes. And it's like, and then you're just like, and now de-escalate. And it's like, okay, that's not just like if we're teaching a self-defense like technique, and it's like, hey, here's the guard, and you want to pass the guard, and I give you some vague principles And then I just say, now pass it. Well, I was like, no, we need to show you some actual techniques to that. And there's actual techniques within de-escalation where we can talk about like how to build rapport effectively, mirroring, how to ask better questions, like open-ended questions and close-ended questions for specific things that you're wanting to. I mean, there's certain books like I read, like on learning how to negotiate and stuff like that, where it's like just there's such tactics to it where it can almost be seen as a little bit of like manipulation within a conversation.
Oh, it is.
That's like, this stuff is still the things that you need to be able to do, because you are playing to the psychology of the person that you're dealing with, and you want them to feel like they are safe and secure. You want to feel like they have a little bit of input within the conversation and the outcome, even if you already know what that outcome is. You want to help kind of guide them towards that. And yeah, so there's different techniques with that. And then at the same time, just like we were talking about with sparring, I love doing like the role play scenarios where it's like, hey, Rory, here's a card, read it. And it's just like, hey, I'm going to pretend to be an inmate in this situation, and my job is just to be a dick, and I'm just going to act up. And then Jonathan, the other officer, has to come over, and he's going to start, hey, Rory, what's going on? And I'm going to be like, well, fucking, I haven't seen my family all fucking year or whatever, and I'm starting to freak out. And I'll just start acting up, and I'm going to try and just I'm going to try and pigeonhole this officer and make him have a hard time or even give up.
Yeah.
And so he's got to try and de-escalate. He's got to try and be calm. He's got to watch his distance with me if I start freaking out. And he's got to use techniques and kind of limit my responses. And there's going to be things that he might fuck up and say that gives me something to bite onto, where it's like, what did you just say? And I'll be able to have fun with it and escalate even further. But if the officer does a really good job, I might just kind of keep treading circles and be like, fuck, I can't, he's not giving me anything to work with. It's kind of like improv, where it's like they're purposely cutting me off so that I can't, even for fun, where it's like, I am literally just, my only job here is to be a dick and try to make Jonathan's life more difficult. And he's still doing a good job being able to de-escalate me. So then when you go up against somebody who's not trained and not thinking about it in that sense, because usually we're looking at someone who's emotionally compromised in some way, it can be even easier to control them, in the sense that they're not going to be logically trying to be defending themselves. But it can obviously be more difficult in the sense that now we are looking at actual risk. And so it becomes just training. And that was something we did at the hospital too, which is really cool, is that we opened up the new emergency department years ago. And we were just pretending to be patients being brought in with different mental health or physical needs. So we're going up to triage, and the ladies there are trying to triage us properly. And then we're finding out the escort routes of which, how do we bring someone from triage all the way down the hall to psychiatric emergency services or psychiatric intensive care, where some people then we need to bring over to the orange and blue areas for different levels of medical triage for physical injuries. And then looking at how we actually sometimes would like bottleneck ourselves and end up like moving two patients at the same time for different things and crossing paths and crashing into each other. So we're doing this role playing where all the different staff members are getting to work on de-escalation and conversation skills. And then we're also testing out just the environment itself and learning how we're going to move this around effectively without crashing into each other and making each other's lives harder. So it's like there's all these different areas. Like the environment plays such a big role too, but the communication part, we have to actually talk about different techniques and then actually drill those techniques by doing more like role-playing scenarios, stuff like that.
It's actually good. Like, it's really good. One problem with that training a lot of the time is when you have a room full of people who can't act and don't like to, and then it's like, come on, guys, like let's do it.
I know there has to be like a certain part where it's just like, hey, we're gonna be kids again and use our imagination, and we're not supposed to be like, it's really just ego that gets in the way, where people feel like they're going to embarrass themselves. They're not going to have certain acting chops, where it's like, I don't have any acting chops. I don't have any training with this, but I'm just going to try and be a jackass. I'm going to have fun with it. I'm going to use swear words and insults that I can't use professionally at work. But because I'm now playing that role, I get to now call this officer a cunt because I know that might cause a reaction from her, because we'll write down a list of the things that are our pet peeves and stuff like that. So then people will know that it's like, hey, certain swear words are being judged for looking too young as an officer, which was like something for me being like 22 when I started in corrections. It's like that kind of stuff where then it's like now the person that's playing can have this thing and be like, oh, Rory doesn't like people commenting on how youthful he looks and that he's probably inexperienced and doesn't know how to fucking do the job. So then they can throw that at me. So that then I have to react and not let that not react to it and not let it affect me and continue doing it. So that then when inevitably I'm in front of inmates and they do something like that to me, I'm going to be already prepared for that.
Yeah.
And we got to have fun with it. And yeah, unfortunately, they can make us do it in, like when we're first hired, because obviously we're first hired and we're a little more go-getters at that point, and we want to impress people because we need to pass the training in order to actually be hired. But yeah, it's harder to get officers in any agency, like, so not just police or corrections, or I'm sure like could be similar in military. Military seems like you guys have your shit way more together when it comes to training and the importance of that.
Well, that depends. I was in a different military. So.
Yeah, so people that have been in the job longer are going to be more resistant to this stuff, where it's like, I'm not interested in joining Rory and trying to do some Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or you guys are going to do some role playing on on spare time to work on training. It's like, no, I don't need to do that. I've already been doing this 20 years and I haven't killed anybody, so I guess I'm doing the job well enough. And there becomes like these standards where it's like, okay, you are arguably being successful at your job. You've done this for 20 years and you're probably still pretty good at it, but there's always the idea that there is constant growth. And I think martial artists do it. I think people in any kind of line of work do it, or whatever their hobby is, where we reach certain levels of satisfaction. And even if it's arguably mediocrity, we'll just be like, it's good enough. I don't need to work on this any longer. It's like, no, I just like in martial artists are better at it than others, I think, where it's like when we're looking at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's like I'm going to constantly be refining these skills that I'm working on. And it's never good enough, because when I say that it's good enough, somebody will immediately punish me for that. And that's the great thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and sparring in any martial art, like boxing or Muay Thai or wrestling.
Some white belt who comes in and you're just like trying to have a lazy day.
Yeah,
like
you get punished. High school, so like if you don't work on something well enough, somebody will punish you for it, and you get that consequence immediately where you go, holy shit, I need to go back and I need to revisit that. I just got hit with that submission. I now need to revisit my defense. Where for police, they could be average at all these different things and still manage to go years on the job and be fine. But then they run into that one situation that's more of extreme and they're not ready for it. And then we see horrible outcomes where either officers are not ready and they get fucked up or even die, or the officer reacts too hard and then the suspect gets horribly hurt and dies. And,
I think that's actually probably a good business plan, is you put together a team of martial artists who understand use of force and then come in as actors to work with people. Now, obviously getting contracts with the forces is impossible here, but I think, it needs to be mandatory. Like, I know you have to do it. I don't care. Cause like that's the thing that, the modern founder of Krav Maga was like, why he basically did it because the Nazis were picking on the Jews and he needed to train everyone. But it's like when he was older, they asked him what's it for, and he's like, oh, so one may walk in peace. And it's like, you hope, like most masters who aren't psychos will be like, I hope I never have to use it, but if I do, I can do it quite well, right? And I think the attitude of a police officer is just, I want to avoid. Oh, I've never had that problem, it's fine. It's like, no, you're delusional. And often when it comes to pure self-defense, and I hate the attitude, like it drives me nuts, this woke nonsense where it's like, well, they shouldn't have attacked you. And I'm like, you're right, but it doesn't matter. They're attacking you, right? And you didn't put any time to learn to defend yourself. Now what? Oh, I can just do this. It's like, how aggressive are they being? I don't think you can do that. Like, and it just, the delusions that people have about.
Yeah, the opinion of the public is usually dog shit with this stuff, where it'd be like, oh, you shouldn't have shot the person there. And it's like, you had a guy running at an officer with a knife repeatedly, and you had the officer backing up and giving clear, concise direction. You had the officer already with the gun pulled out. So any reasonable person could look at that and go, if I keep charging at this officer with a gun drawn at me, I'm going to get shot. And we could make arguments of mental health and make arguments of being under some, like having being intoxicated by drugs. And unfortunately that sucks.
Yeah.
Like some of the guys that have gotten shot recently, it's like everyone will jump on whether it was racism or excessive force. And it's just like one person has to go down in that circumstance. And I wish that the suspect that got shot was not on drugs. I wish that they were more mentally stable. I wish that so many more things positively happened in their lives that could have changed the course of their life for the better. But in that situation, you had an officer who was just trying to do their job and do it well at first, in the sense that they're trying to communicate and de-escalate. And then within a split second, the communication has to stop because the guy's running at him with a knife. And it's like, you can't tell me that the officer is supposed to risk their life and take on the knife with just their hands. Cause like people will have the opinion, like everyone's John Wick, where it's like, no, the guy's coming at you with a knife, you disarm it. It's like, I am never, ever taking on a knife, because I have trained that stuff, and I've decided not even bother training it because it's such diminishing returns that it's like, I could train this shit for 20 years and I could train it at a high level intensity where we're actually using like a high voltage knife and they're really trying to come at me. And then I might still just fuck it up. And in one split second, I'm dead.
Yeah.
In real life. Like, you can't train this stuff.
Sure.
It's so difficult.
Yeah. The night, I was going to say, it's a very North American thing about like, oh, why'd you shoot? I'm serious. You go to any other place in the world, they'll be like, oh, they were charging at the officer with a knife and they shot him. Like Israel, like I tell people, like, though Krav Maga heavily focuses on knife self-defense, the reality is in Israel, you charge anyone with a knife, you're getting shot, and nobody bats an eye about it there. It's like, well, you shouldn't have charged him with the knife. Same in Europe, South America, like everywhere. It's a very North American thing. Now, it's a valid point you bring up about the knife stuff. And I always find myself reminding people that trained martial artists have a tendency to be like, oh, I'll just stab you. And you probably will. When you look at YouTube, like crimes of passions with knives, or like decisions in the moment to attack, are usually those big movements. So the way I break it down is we have committed and non-committed attacks, and then circular, outside in, and straight line. And you'll actually find, look at like YouTube, you see people that lunging, and that's what we're trying to teach you for, is that initial moment of panic. And then you either can get a hold of that weapon arm or you can't. And if you can't, create space, run if you couldn't already run. And if you can get a hold of that weapon arm, the psychology kicks in of at least for a few seconds, they want to get that weapon back. And that's where you have room to operate. And of course, you get the guys who come in with John Wick, oh, I'm stabbing you every time. It's like, well, yeah, if you're going in with the intent to kill every single time, then yeah, you just go psycho blender and stab the shit out of people, and there's not much you can do.
The martial arts community is getting better in the sense of always recommending run, because like like for me, when it comes to like a weapon, it's like 1, run every time. 2, give them hopefully whatever they want. If it is something like a robbery, there's going to be a lot of times where guys are just making empty threats and they're not actually even going to use the knife. I've talked to lots of inmates where they're just like, oh yeah, I got like these armed robberies. And it's like, I would never have done anything with that. It is an empty threat. But I mean, obviously there are real threats.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, for me, it's like, I'm always scanning the environment in the sense where it's like, if someone has a weapon, I'm grabbing the chair next to me. Like, I'm going to fight back with another weapon before I try and fight back barehanded, because Jesus Christ. And then there might even be the times where, there was a couple months ago, there was a guy posting in like one of the big Facebook groups that guys that train jiu-jitsu, and he's a police officer and was doing weapon retention and pulling a gun, and like a guy was chasing at him with a knife, his training partner, and he chose to fall onto his back and pull guard so that he could utilize his legs as frames to manage the distance, so he could quickly draw the gun and shoot the guy. And he was finding that was the only way in that circumstance that he could actually maintain a bit of a safe distance for a moment to be able to pull out the gun and be able to fight, versus like when you're standing, 1, holding onto the gun can be more difficult, but 2, your upper body is much closer and it's going to be easier for you to get stabbed. So I mean, like obviously you train more knife defense to properly take on some of those swings, but then for me, because of my training, in certain circumstances, and I'm not recommending it like it's like a flat line, because that's just or the universal approach, because that's another thing that people are bad at when it comes to self-defense. There's no one answer for anything. There'll be times where I know that because of my jiu-jitsu experience, it's going to be safer for me to fall to my back if I had another weapon to be able to fight with, or to be able to buy time until backup could arrive. That's obviously not going to be a great idea self-defense wise, because now I'm not mobile at all and I can't run from the situation.
Well, it isn't like so I teach falling to the back to shoot, but as you've lost your footing, you were about to hit it, like something's gone wrong, so you teach them that you can fall with your gun drawn and you'll be fine. But if you're stuck there and screw up, it's a mess. and that's where it turns into some nasty.
There's no good answer for the most part when someone's running at you with a knife. It's like, I would love to be able to say that, like, that guy's going to take a swing and you're going to do this big Aikido takedown. He's going to land on his back and you're going to tie him up nicely. And it's like, it's going to be such an ugly fight. And the problem with the knife is that thing, if it hits you at all, it's going to, like, you're going to get cut. So you got to minimize where you're getting cut. And
that's a big thing. Where, like, I teach that. I'm like, I don't know if you're going to get cut or not. I have no idea. But what matters is where. Like, if you get cut in the femoral, people always forget about it. I'm like, you get stabbed there, you're fucked.
Don't take it in the neck. It's basic spots where it's like, you got to keep them away from you. And so then that's
keeping people hands up, like, protect your vitals immediately. And that takes a while to get people, because the worst case scenario, you get cut up, you get stitches, and you're alive. Right.
Yeah. So that's where, like, if we're talking about workforce, you might not be able to avoid those situations. And so then it becomes down to that training aspect again, where it's like, how do we allocate time to all this stuff? So that's where, like, for me as an officer, I would rather spend the majority of my time working on the communication aspect, working on my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills to be able to control the majority of the guys that I'm going to work with, because weapons are still not something that we would deal with very often. Yeah. And then when there are weapons, looking at, well, how do we start to use, like, the weapons that we have available to us, intermediary weapons like a baton or pepper spray, or as a police officer, looking at, unfortunately, like, using the gun and working on your firearm skills there. Because to me, I'm like, because once we start taking all that, and then if I start to go, well, you know what, actually, I want to bridge the gap a little bit, and I want to work on my knife defense and taking on other, like, blunt weapons.
Yeah.
Then it's like, now I'm pulling away from the other resources. And once again, I think there's still that diminishing returns where it's like, it's just not worth it to me, where I would rather spend the time avoiding that conflict, or just, unfortunately, if it had to happen, ending it, whether it was with lethal force or less than lethal means, hopefully, to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And then when we're looking at basic self-defense, for most people, when they're coming to jiu-jitsu to try and wanting to do some self-defense, it's like, okay, that's cool. And it's a great reason to get into Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You're not going to stay for just that reason, training out of fear. You'll probably learn to just love the martial art, and you'll train, and self-defense will be a consequence of that, in the sense that, like, you have the ability to defend yourself. But for me, it's like, okay, you want to for self-defense, and you want to avoid fights. One, don't fucking drink alcohol, and don't hang out with people that drink alcohol or do drugs.
Bad life
that's gonna avoid, like, all 90% of all the altercations you would ever deal with. And then don't walk around at nighttime down dark alleys, and, like, obviously,
you say such a thing.
Yeah. So, like, women, unfortunately, are going to be more likely to be attacked, in the sense, by people that they know, or for other reasons, because they're just, like, easier targets from a physicality standpoint. But especially men, it's like, we're fucking idiots for the most part. And it's like, you got to learn how to control your emotions. You got to learn how to communicate. You need to stop drinking, and you need to stop hanging out with people that drink, because it's like the fights at bars were just all the time. And it's, people are like, oh, you work at a jail? That's so fucked up. And it's like, actually, you take all these guys that are kind of considered the scum of the earth, and you take away drugs, you take away alcohol, and you force them in this environment, and they're actually really decent people to talk to. They have their quirks and they have their deficiencies, and when they're out and they're in that environment where they're able to do drugs and do harder drugs, they're obviously just off the rails. But the jail, I feel quite safe at. Where at the bar, you'd have these functioning members of society that contribute to the community, but they're coming in off their jobs and they're drinking their faces off, and they become so arrogant, they become selfish, they become violent. You got men sexually assaulting women, you got men beating the shit out of each other, you got women beating the shit out of men. And it's just become such a mess, where the violence that I would deal with at the bar was way more extreme than at the jail. And it's like, oh yeah, it's alcohol. It's like the main factor here. So, like, when it comes to self-defense, like, it's important, but a lot of different lifestyle changes to me is like the thing. Like, I've never been in a fight outside of work. Now, I'm a 6'5", 185-pound white male. So it's like, I got certain privileges, I guess, if you want to call it that, in the sense that it's like,
I'm putting it out there.
Yeah, people are not going to be approaching me as, like, an easy target.
Yeah.
But
as opposed to a 6'5" black guy, isn't it? Like, I don't understand. Like,
yeah,
as a 5'6" guy, like, if you're taller than me, I'm like, I'd rather not. I mean, on average, I could probably mess them up, but
Yeah, so there's going to be certain factors, like unfortunately, somebody of like a different race where they might be a target of racism, or like I said, women when it comes to like sexual advances from men that are or sexual assaults and actual attacks. Like I'm not going to tell people that it's like you can avoid fights at all, like by any means. There's still a chance, but for so many people, it's like you could change your lifestyle and not ever and have a way less likely of a chance of being needing some sort of self-defense techniques.
Yeah. Every once in a while, I get a student who's like, "Oh yeah, I got in a fight again." I'm like, "Okay, whoa, again?" And you have to have
Yeah,
that conversation. It's like, okay,
you got to look
like,
inward.
what are you doing? Like, I had a student for a bit, and he was telling me this story once. He worked in the movie industry about how some guy stole some stuff and he chased him down, and then blah blah blah, and then the pimp got involved. I don't know. But his version of the story versus the version of the story I heard from a friend of ours who told me what he actually said. I'm like, okay, that's
Yeah,
completely avoidable. You making like it's not your property, it's your word. Like, who cares? Like, and it was just like obviously this person's just continually making bad decisions about when they get in fights, and it's just like
yeah. Some of my friends would get mad at me like in our early 20s because like we'd be out at the bar and then a fight breaks out because like the one example, we ran into a couple guys from like the rival city next to us, Parksville Qualicum, and then they started shit talking us. So then my friends, of course, just start escalating and matching it back. And it's like, well, can we just be the bigger men and walk away from this? That would have solved everything. But instead, they chose to escalate. And that's usually what ends up happening from a communication standpoint. And a breakdown is that people and their egos get in the way. And they're just like, oh, yeah, you're going to insult me. I'm going to throw insults back at you. And it starts to escalate. I'm in the middle trying to calm this thing down. Even as a drunk, I would always try and calm the situation down. And then they're still escalating from it. And then it starts into a fight. So then at that point, my job to me is just make sure my friends don't get hurt. I honestly don't really care if they win or lose. Like I want them to win because I'm still like, they're my bros, but I just want to make sure that they don't get hurt. So it's like there was 3 of them and 3 of us. I just tie up the 3rd guy while my 2 friends fight and beat the crap out of the 2 other guys. And then when the other guy tries to get in there, I let him go because I can see that my friend has already taken care of one of the guys pretty decently. And then my friend beats up the other guy. And then they're like, why didn't you take that guy out? And it's like, I didn't want this fight.
Yeah.
It's not my job to get in there. And like, if you get attacked, if we got just attacked and it was a self-defense thing, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to brawl.
That's
but in this
too.
circumstance, I tried to de-escalate and they chose to still engage it. So it's like, it's your mess. Clean that shit up. Fortunately, my friends were pretty decent at being able to clean that stuff up.
Yeah.
But it's like, man, this is where like men, especially women, are guilty of it too, where there's just this ego where they just keep escalating, throwing the insults back until it eventually turns into a physical altercation. It's like, that's what we need to get better at. And we need to actually learn more, whether we're spending time in school actually learning about this stuff rather than unimportant information that we learn throughout middle school and high school.
Yeah.
Learning how to be better people and how to actually have proper conversations with
financial
each other.
literacy is huge too.
Yeah.
But, no, it seems to be considered. Like I obviously avoid situations where I think there's going to be fights, but the occasional that there has, I don't jump in unless I feel someone's going to go to the hospital or there's going to be a threat. Because I've
watched some of my friends get like beat up a bunch standing, and it's just like as soon as it goes to the ground, it can go to that next level where someone's getting stomped or something. It's like I'm breaking it up like a ref. But it's like if my friend started this fight and wanted to have that fight and he got lit up standing a bunch and his nose is bleeding and he's got a black eye, I just look at him and be like, you're an idiot. I stepped in to protect you to make sure you didn't like die or get seriously hurt. But it's like, if you want that fight, you're going to get a little bit of a licking standing. That's on you, man.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot of things we can talk about. I do want to go to like sort of the small, like the woman teaching women self-defense or that kind of stuff, because I do get a little annoyed. Like I'm not like a black belt, obviously, but I get annoyed at jujitsu a lot when I see jujitsu practitioners teaching self-defense to women or teaching it to men even or police, and I'm just like, what are you fucking doing? Like, let's take a triangle, for example. It's a great technique, but how long does it take for someone to get proficient at it to use it in meaningful, violent confrontation, like 100-pound girl versus a 200-pound guy. I struggle putting triangles on guys that big. And it's like, it drives me nuts. It's like, yes, it's an amazing technique, high percentage in professional fighting. Mike Hansen gets me it all the fucking time because he's so good at them. But it's like, if I have a seminar for self-defense and you're starting with, hey, here's a triangle, it's going to work. It's like, probably not. If they're like 200 pounds trying to rape you, I just don't see it unless you've been doing it for 5-10 years. And yeah, you got a good shot. I don't know. What do you think?
I put my friend in a triangle once when I was just like drunk grappling at like my friend's place, and he bit the inside of my thigh as I was slowly putting it on, and I had such big bruises and I had to let go of it. Now obviously if you do a triangle really well, they're not going to be able to bite you, but there's these different risks with certain things like arm bars and triangles where it's like you said, it takes a lot. In the same way, I hate when somebody on their first day of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu learns how to do an armbar from closed guard. It's like, it's just not realistic. They're not going to be able to replicate it. And the fact of them trying to replicate it could actually hurt people more as training partners. So Rob and I teach women's self-defense seminars once in a while. And the first thing we always kind of just say at the beginning is like, listen, you ladies are probably not going to be much better at defending yourselves by the end of this. Yeah. We're going to give you some ideas. We're going to give you some ideas of communication, how to properly distance yourself, assess the environment. We're going to give you some basic understanding of how to strike. And like, we're talking just like some basic, like jab kind of cross to have an understanding of how that could work. Some different wrist grab, like disengagements, breaks.
Yeah.
And it's like, you'll learn that, but you have to keep practicing it, because if you don't, it's not going to fucking work. So don't think that you can come in for this 2-hour class and you're going to be able to be like bulletproof out there and stop any kind of attacks. It's like, this is an understanding to hopefully show you how, like a little step into how deep this rabbit hole can go, and to put the onus on you that you need to actually train this stuff regularly if you want to train self-defense. And like, you don't need a lot to be competent enough to be able to defend yourself. Obviously, when we're talking about physical advantages, like a smaller woman is going to have to be better technically than say me at 6'5" or crazier. But there's just a reality, like, and it's sold a lot in jiu-jitsu falsely, where size doesn't matter. And it's like, okay, that's an important principle, and there's a lot of detail behind that we could break down about how it is kind of the case in some ways, and how we can try and minimize the gap of physicality. But there's a reason why there's weight classes in boxing and mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu, is because if you got equally trained people, the bigger person will just bulldoze the other person. Yeah. So it's one of those things that's like, there's a lot of training. That's where, like, I tell people, it's like, hey, you want to train for self-defense? That's great.
Yeah.
We're going to train jiu-jitsu. We're like, honestly, for like regular Brazilian jiu-jitsu, for like how Rob and I teach, we won't get into takedowns at first, because takedowns are more dangerous, because you have that the loss of control of each other's center of gravity and the momentum, as we talked about, 2 full-grown men going to the ground, or women, there's more chance of being injured. So I need to show you how to first be comfortable with your body, learn how to control your body and control your opponent's body on the ground. Then we'll start working on how to actually take them down there with takedowns, but also working on how to do proper break falls and stuff, so you guys are less likely to injure yourself. So then there becomes this like, well, how long is it going to take me to be street ready? And it's like, I don't know, it's going to take time, because you're going to first learn a bunch of stuff on the ground, and then we'll show you how to actually take somebody down, and you'll still suck ass at that stuff. And we're not even doing this within a self-defense realm. And this, like, so you can have the ability to actually be like in this clinch, closer in fighting range, and then you might be more comfortable on the ground. But when we're looking at like the distance out fighting range with strikes, you could have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu blue belt that just gets lit up with the first punch that comes at them, because they're not training that stuff. So it's like, well, then we need to actually start to talk about that. And you either need to supplement your training with like boxing, Muay Thai, kickboxing, or other martial arts, but those are the ones that I recommend the most. Or we need to actually have self-defense orientated classes where we talk about closing that distance and doing that properly, because that's where you're, I think you've also kind of referenced or hinted to, where it's like, when we talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we have very sport orientated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I think a lot of it, if done well, is still going to be super applicable to self-defense. And like the super fancy stuff like Baron Bolos and rolling back attacks and stuff like that. It's like that. No one's going to do that in a self-defense situation, and no one argues that they would do that in a self-defense situation. But looking at then self-defense, how we close that, but still have a sport orientated perspective to it. Because honestly, like whenever I've trained with a lot of people, and the people that are more focused on competition and sport are much better at jiu-jitsu. And almost every single person I've trained with that's like, oh, I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu for self-defense and I don't do that sports stuff, I do the self-defense stuff, they're dog shit at
Yeah.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
And it's just because now they're training certain shittier techniques that don't have that we're not seeing in competitions. We're not seeing it through that filtration process of what legitimately works against high level practitioners. We're now theoretically talking about what works on the shittiest opponents possible. That drunk guy that throws that haymaker, when someone drunkenly grabs your shirt and isn't really doing anything off of that, or when someone's got like some super shitty mount on you. And so you're training these techniques to beat the lowest common denominator, rather than trying to beat black belts. And if you train to beat black belts, or if you train to beat high-level boxers, then you've covered your ass for everything underneath that, which is who you're more likely going to be dealing with.
Yeah.
And so, man, like, yeah, self-defense, like, I don't think that there's too much of a gap between proper sport jiu-jitsu and self-defense jiu-jitsu, as some people like to say there is. But there's shitty sports jiu-jitsu, which is bad for self-defense, and you got really shitty self-defense jiu-jitsu that's terrible for self-defense as well as terrible for sport jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Well, my approach, like I do cover grappling in my curriculum for Krav, but I'm covering so much that I tell everyone, if you want a black belt from me in Krav, you need to go get a blue belt or equivalent in jiu-jitsu, or 5 years, or like you got to put in the grappling, because you know, when you have people, like it was a problem in the Krav community for a long time, is the grappling was shit because it's stand up heavy, like, oh, we're never going to go to the ground. And you know, I was an earlier adopter. I've noticed slowly a lot of them are starting to do more grappling, or some of the organizations with a bit better grappling backgrounds are starting to take off, because they're realizing, like, for law enforcement and military, it's actually really necessary. And then when strikes are not available, it's really necessary. So like when I'm teaching ground stuff for Krav, it's more like, here's the positions, here's what's good position, here's what's not a good position, basic escapes, strikes allowed, groin strikes, grab, pull, whatever you got to do. But I'm like, listen, if a and I actually realized I had the wake up call. I did a seminar with Luana Alazagar a long time ago. And it's just like, I watched her run through like 10 male black belts in a row. And I'm like, man, if you run into even like, I don't know, a decent high school wrestler from in the States, you're fucked if you don't know how to grapple. And it really, you do need it. It's just like how you approach it. And I know you and Rob are always like, if it doesn't work on a black belt, fuck it. Like arm bars from the guard, I never do them, because it's just like, I'm not going to get them anyway. My short little legs, it's hard to throw over and get the leverage. But it's like that disconnect between reality, practical biology. Like I say, you can't cheat physics, size matters. You can cheat it with biology. If you kick them in the nuts, you have a few seconds, you know, stuff like that. And just learning how this works, the physics and biology. And actually, I think objectively, like I had a Krav Maga instructor who approached from first principles first, and then I met Rob and you, and then it's like, it really opened my eyes, like, oh, this is a much better way to teach. I think the base principle of the concept. You guys do levers and frames and all that stuff. I find though, a lot of people, when you start talking about conceptual, they just like glaze over and they're like, what the fuck? I just want to like, how do you deal with that? Because I love the conceptual stuff, but so many people hate it. Like, how do you teach that and deal with it when you run into that?
I'm going to leave that quick pause just so I can take a leak.
Yeah.
Then we're going to get into that. I've been drinking a lot of coffee.
Okay, so we're back. How do you handle that situation, if you recall?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult because we're going against the grain of how things have been taught for a very long time. And so there is becoming increased popularity towards a conceptual approach where we talk about like the underlying physics and reasons behind these techniques and why they work. But you still got a lot of gyms and individuals that aren't used to this approach. And so then also with that, you have people that are trying to do it that aren't good at it. And so it becomes a more cluttered mess. And so jiu-jitsu is very complicated, and there are so many techniques. like at 12 years of training and as a black belt, there are certain things and certain guards specifically that I just have not spent much time in. There are techniques that I haven't really bothered to touch, or techniques that I know of, but I haven't bothered to refine and get really good at, because I'd rather be good at a select few kinds of submissions and finding multiple paths to get to those submissions rather than having every submission kind of just be average at best. So you got so much with that, and then you're trying to throw in this other idea, and if it's not explained in a concise, systematic way that bridges that gap, it can just kind of become more muddled. And so that's where, like, Rob's done a really good job of creating a overarching set of concepts that are tying into everything. And so from a cognitive like learning strategy, we're looking at how we can actually like make this simpler, and that you can learn this and break it down into smaller chunks. And you can take those chunks, and then when you learn something like, say, the arm bar, and now we go back to talking about the triangle, where then we move towards the rear naked choke, there's going to be certain concepts that can be explained and linked to all those. Obviously, chokes, strangulations are going to be more interconnected to other chokes and strangulations, and other joint locks are going to be connected to other joint locks, where then it's like, oh, I'm not just learning this whole brand new thing over again. I'm hearing the same concept of alignment, base, posture, structure. We're talking about frames and levers. We're talking about center of gravity, stability, and balance. Talking about these things that are always occurring, and then gives people the idea of how to have some recognition about what's occurring. So that, like, the technical approach to me is kind of like babies when they're playing with the toy, where you got like the blocks of certain shapes, and you're trying to find the corresponding hole to put them in. At first, the baby is just taking that shape, and there's just frantically kind of just jamming it until it eventually works. And then it works, and they're like, yay, that's great. But they had all the points of failure because they didn't understand where to actually put that shape. And so eventually it becomes not even a game to us anymore. We just look at it and go, yeah, circle goes to circle, triangle to triangle. It's simple. We understand that. And that's what starts to happen when it'll happen faster if you understand conceptually. I don't know if you hear my cat screaming in the back, but they're getting close to dinner time. Where people are able to recognize what's going on, instead of just being like, oh, I need to try and make this one sweep happen at all times. It's like you start to have a better understanding of Kazushi, so that you can off balance your opponents, so you can create a vulnerability by breaking their posture, by denying them some base, by affecting their structure, which is the efficient, effective positioning of their limbs, to create those openings to then make techniques work. And so if it can be explained better, then that's where then people will be like, oh man, I can understand that. Or when we're doing seminars, sometimes my blanket universal kind of like speech on alignment is not enough for them. But when somebody has their own actual problem, and I can explain how these concepts tie into their problem, then that will be that next hurdle that kind of breaks through to them, where they're like, okay, now I can actually personalize this message that you're sending to me. Now I get it. Or also in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the great thing about just learning, and this is for technical and conceptual, is that I get to beat the crap out of people. And so to a certain extent, especially with lower belts, obviously other black belts are going to like hold their own or beat the crap out of me. But when a student's trying to learn something and they're resistant and they want to try and do it a certain way, whether the technique itself is crap, which is certainly something that occurs all the time, or they don't understand when or why to use that technique, they don't understand any concepts behind it, they get to experience failure over and over again, whether it's grappling with me or grappling with students of similar belt levels. Like, we have the visiting student program at Island Top Team, so we get people from all over the world that come out, and Rob does a really good job building high level white belts and blue belts, which is like the majority of the club, as most clubs. And we have other white belts and blue belts come, and they're like, holy crap,
I remember that feeling.
Yeah, your blue belts have such a advanced understanding of guard retention. It's like, well, I mean, they have a few techniques, but they understand how those techniques tie together, and they understand the main goal of guard retention and the different ranges of guard and when to use those tools at the appropriate times, rather than some brown belts even that I've trained with, where it's just like, man, your guard retention is just a mess in certain areas. Like, really great skills technically, like the techniques, if I told them to rep a high leg, or if I told them to rep a Granby, or to show me like a hip escape and other stuff, they're going to be probably brown belts at all those techniques. They're very good in these individualized parts. But then when we put it together, and the understanding of how we tie that together, and when the technique is the appropriate time to use it, and when you want to actually use other techniques instead, or maybe they're missing one technique because they're not looking at the full picture, then all of a sudden it starts to fall apart when somebody can exploit it. And so that's where we have false positives in other gyms where you got people that just aren't great at jiu-jitsu, or your training partners. Like if you're doing anything on a white belt, you could do it horribly. And so you can be like, man, my triangle choke is really good. And it's like, well, you're doing it to white belts, so they don't know how to defend it. They don't know how to do anything. They probably also aren't comfortable fighting that submission to the very end because they don't know what their limit is, especially with joint locks. That's more something that happens because no one wants to hurt themselves. We all have jobs for the most part. And so then people will come and train with higher level people. And that's not just like us. It's going to be anyone that's higher level, especially those that compete. And then they'll be like, man, I cannot set this up. I can either never actually get that technique set up like a triangle. I can never enter that position. Or when I do, I just can't actually finish anybody. Or when I realize that I'm shitting the bed with this triangle, I don't have an exit strategy. And so I just get my guard passed every time. And then you go like, man, here is a legitimate submission that we see at the highest level, but I can still train this legitimate submission poorly. Yeah. And so there's the conceptual approach to it, I think is definitely like the better way for like as a learning strategy. And you got to be really good at explaining it to people, being able to teach it. And you also got to be able to back it up, because if Rob was talking about all this conceptual stuff, and when I first trained with him, if I just beat the shit out of him, I would have been like, cool, man, I'm going to go back to this other gym. But it's like Rob got to shit kick me after I had trained for several years, like 4 years, I think, talking about doing the German jiu-jitsu with submission grappling, and then actually doing some Brazilian jiu-jitsu at some other clubs before Rob opened up in Nanaimo. Yeah. And then we were like, I was like a 4-stripe white belt. I could beat up most of the blue belts in the area. All our jiu-jitsu sucked. Yeah. So I'm not like blowing smoke at my ass. It's like I was a big fish in a very small pond. We sucked. But then a black belt came to the area, and I was like, most of us were like, hey, let's see if this guy's actually a black belt, because we don't see black belts very often, let alone on Vancouver Island where I live.
And yeah, for sure. Now
it's more common now. So we went, and yeah, that's also the great thing about the sparring aspect is I got to go, here's a guy that's a similar build to me. I got some skill. I'm going to take it to him. And then he just fucking smeared me into the mat like hot dog shit. And I was just like, wow, I don't know anything about jiu-jitsu. Yeah. And then when he started explaining the concepts behind all the different techniques, there's a technical aspect that I had to obviously rise up to, and I need to improve everything. And then there's the conceptual part that just helps streamline that stuff and level it up. So some people will have arguments of like, what's better, a conceptual or a technical approach? And they'll almost create this divide like they don't exist together. And I don't like that, because I'll see some conceptual teachers be like, I don't like to teach techniques. It's like, what the fuck? I'm not having a class on today's class is about base, or this is a class about frames or center of gravity. It's like, no, these things are always taking place within the techniques, and the techniques are the things that we need to visualize and to be able to actually perform these. And so once again, just like I was saying, kind of with self-defense and sport, I think conceptual and technical are very just closely connected, and there shouldn't be like that divide between the two.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree. That's how I approach my Krav. Now I will say, my guard retention got a lot better after training with you guys, just because the concept of it's like, I think the question was, how do I get out of side control? And Rob's like, don't fucking get there. And then that shift of like, oh, you're right. And then, I'm not a cardio monster, and everyone knows if you tire me out, you can pass my guard. But until then, my guard is like, because I'm like, I'm not fucking letting you pass anymore. And it just that shift. And I'm not the kind of guy who's going to sit there watching videos all day. It's just not me. So if I shortcut with the concepts, it's like, oh, what am I doing wrong? Oh, my alignment's off. Oh, just fix that. Oh, now it's so much better. Right.
Well, that's the problem solving part of it. I'll have white belts where it's like, I'll knock them over. Yeah. And then I'll be like, why did that not work? And they'll be like, because I didn't have my foot posted in the right spot. So I had poor base, and my center of gravity fell outside of my platform of support. I'll be like, Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's exactly why that happened. Perfect. Like, they start to be able to recognize why there's failure. And so that's another important part of that conceptual approach, is that white belts, when you first start, your goals cannot be about winning and just measuring success by taps or by guard passes. You're going to have more failure than you are success. And so by being able to even recognize why you're experiencing failure, why your guard got passed, why you ended up in a bad spot, why you got submitted, you win in a sense, in the sense of like, well, it's either like you're never losing, you're learning, which like I don't agree with the whole thing, but it's like when it comes to like a training environment, yeah. And as long if you just lose and you don't understand and you're like, oh, I'm just getting armbar, this is bullshit, this guy's better than me, you're not going to get much better at jiu-jitsu quickly. Yeah. But every time you get armbarred, if you recognize what happened within that situation, how you either created the vulnerability yourself because as white belts were idiots and we just put ourselves in submissions against skilled guys, or we recognize what that person did to create that vulnerability, then it's going to be less likely for it to happen next time because you're going to be trying to correct that. Yeah. And so that's where I love that conceptual approach the most when I see it with people that are first learning, is that they start to recognize what's going on, or I can at least through like a Socratic method of teaching, be able to guide them towards that goal, where I can start to ask them questions to funnel them to the answer that they basically already know, but they just can't find it. And I'm able to just kind of be like, well, how was your base? My base was fine. Show me. Okay. How was your posture? Oh yeah. My spine was, I had integrity of my spinal column. I felt quite strong there. Okay. How was your structure? Then they'll start talking about their arm position. They'll be like, oh, actually, maybe I had my elbow way too open and that internal rotation of my shoulder, like my right arm was pretty weak in this situation. And I'll be like, there you go. You knew it. You could find it. I just needed to kind of guide you there. So it also helps from a pedagogy side, where to be able to teach people and help them recall that information. I think it's excellent.
Yeah. And it's in Krav, like traditional Krav, it's technique, teach aggression, like both absolutely necessary. And then I was introduced to a guy named Nir Maman, who's an absolute monster of a human being, among other things. But he, having grown up in Toronto, actually, then doing counterterrorism over in Israel. And then his approach was the like North American way. I'm going to talk more, even though he can kick the shit out of you. It's like, I want you to understand what you're doing. And it like opened my eyes. This must have been in 2012 or 13, where I'm like, oh, like, because if you ask the average Israeli Krav instructor, why does it work? They're like, because it works. He's on the ground. And it's like, but that doesn't solve a lot of people's problems. Like, I need to understand what I'm doing. So then I was introduced to Nir and his teaching style, and then you guys, and thank God I trained with you and Matt Kwan before I went over to Danaher in New York, because otherwise I would have been totally lost, because that guy's a monster. But it sticks once you get the ideas, and it's like really it changes people. And once you understand what it is you're doing, I find the learning curve is so much faster. Unfortunately, there's always people who are just like, I just need to do it. And I'm like, that's true, but wouldn't you like to understand it too?
Yep. Yeah, it should be like, I like to think of it as being like a conscious grappler, where it's like you are like any little grip, anything that you do in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu should have a purpose. And obviously as a white belt, you're not going to understand all that. You're going to make mistakes. That's part of getting better. But as a black belt, especially, it's like, I know exactly why I'm gripping certain parts of the gi or grabbing certain parts of my opponent's body for rotational control or for leverage, etc. I can explain any of it. Yeah. But I'll train with people that are purple belts, and it's like, well, why are you putting your arm there every time when you're trying to knee cut?
Yeah.
Because that's what I was showed. Oh, okay. So you're parroting this information. You don't actually understand it. You just replicate it. Now, some people, if they're given the right technique, like picture perfect, and they're learning from like one of the world's best guys, replicating it can absolutely be enough, because it's going to be already as perfect as it can be, or at least at a very high level, where by being able to replicate that over and over again and just be a fucking robot with it and not screw up, that can absolutely breed success. I think it takes longer to learn, and I don't think a lot of us have the time to put in like that, to learn like that, or in the same sense where when we talk about being able to assess and problem solve a situation where we're experiencing failure, there are guys that I've trained with that are world champions at their respective belts or at the highest level, where it's like they don't understand concepts really and why certain things work, but because they train so much, they've experienced failure so much that through a process of elimination, they have found what works. Yeah. And so if you go back and be like, well, but it just took them many more hours to realize that those certain paths didn't work, and they had to put their hand in one specific spot here for proper base. It usually still just ties to the concepts where we can eliminate that where, like for me, when I first was progressing through some of my belts, I was really only training 2, maybe 3 times a week,
Yeah.
an hour or 2 per training session. But I was still able to keep skyrocketing in my development because it was very disciplined training, in the sense that I knew what I had to work on, but at the same time, every movement I was doing, I could figure out, or as soon as I experienced failure, I could correct it immediately and not experience that failure too many times after that. And I would consciously learn from that versus like if I was just trying to do that by process of elimination, it would take me so much longer to just experience that failure to get to that point where the people, these high level competitors that say train 30 to 40 hours a week, they will naturally end up sifting through the garbage and finding the best stuff, also with good instructors. So, but for the average person, if you want to be able to cut down your learning time and the development time, then conceptual approach, I think, is hands down the best. And then when we have high level competitors, people that are that disciplined, unlike a piece of shit like me that just trains part-time, like on Vancouver Island, without and doesn't have like the highest level teammates to be able to push ourselves, like say like Kyotera Association or Art of Jiu-Jitsu with the Mendes brothers, where it's like you're breeding world champions at every belt and they're pushing themselves. You take one of those teams and you really bring in a strong conceptual approach with that too, I think they could escalate and elevate their game even further.
Death Squad, basically.
Yeah, Dan or Death Squad. That's what I mean. They're like the one example where we can see high level guys training that also have systems and concepts, and we can see how they're tearing it up. And we can see what's cool is that it is starting to put that conceptual approach more on the map, and people can see that it's a great way to learn. But even then, some people don't like learning from John Danaher.
Well, it's tough. Like it is, he is a whole different.
He does not dumb down the language too much, as well as for some people, he talks too slowly. I know, like obviously, it's not new stuff to me, so it's a bit hard for me to be engaged. But some of his videos are longer-winded than I personally like. But then there's some people that listen to me or listen to Rob Biernacki, and they don't like our approach. So it's like you have to have you have to have the right approach, and you're gonna have certain instructors that you gravitate towards. And so hopefully with these different whether it's different conceptual approaches, because like Rob Biernacki and John Danaher are very similar in their approach of these universal concepts, but Rob will talk much faster than John. Rob has definitely not changed his personality. That's where like I think a large part of our subscriber base and fans just like the political incorrectness and us just being ourselves. But at the same time, like neither of us or John Danaher might reach out to some people, and then you have other people that teach very different conceptual stuff where I would argue it's almost not even conceptual, it's more just like heuristics, where it's like there can still be some interesting ideas that create some food for thought and help you like within one small part, but it doesn't apply to anything else in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so it's like some of that stuff I'm like, that's not really the conceptual stuff I'm talking about. And so some people will look at that and be like, that's why conceptual stuff, the conceptual approach isn't worth it. And it's like, all right, well, there's bad technical approaches and there's bad conceptual approaches, or not necessarily bad, but just not the best way of doing it. So that's going to be a growing process. So I'm interested to see, especially in the next like 5 to 10 years, how much the game shifts in the sense of pedagogy, the art and skill of teaching within Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because that's a whole nother skill in itself.
Well, in martial arts in general, there's a lot of shitty instructors just in general who can't articulate, especially for like self-defense. It's like for me, it's like a legal thing. If you can't articulate why you did what you did, you might be screwed in court. Now, something I do want to talk about before your cat kills you is your project of self-defense or use of force for nursing. I'm interested to hear about that, and because I actually have students who do security, not nurses, but security in one of the hospitals that's quite well known for shenanigans for that, and like they're always asking.
Hospitals are violent places.
So
tell me hospital. So it's healthcare control strategies and self-defense. I work protection services for the Nanaimo Hospital for 3 years, which is basically just a fancy word for like in-house security. And it was extremely violent. And my jiu-jitsu training, because of the conceptual approach, I was able to modify how I'm using techniques to be able to help control patients and do so effectively and not hurt them. So when I'm talking about like that, I'm not talking about using triangle chokes and other kind of means like on patients. We're talking about even just understanding how to use grips effectively, how to use frames and body weight to be able to control patients in their beds, how to control their legs, how to escort patients effectively, whether it's just from a where I'm just being nice and helping somebody and they're not really violent, but they're just struggling, or they are kind of escalating a bit, which is why security is there, versus actually having to physically escort a patient to like a seclusion room in like psychiatric, in the psychiatric unit or in the emergency unit, where we have to actually segregate them in a secure room, and be able to do so under this like even more intense restriction, where we're not just talking about like a legal level of force, but because it's a hospital and there's this care setting and we have the term patient being used, there's extra emphasis that we are to care for this individual. And so even if the force was deemed legally reasonable, I'm still going to probably be more heavily scrutinized within the hospital setting, because man, like a patient's going to be upset, the family's going to be super impatient, super upset about why their grandfather was at a hospital and he somehow ended up getting hurt during medical duties that were being carried out because security or the nurses used too much force. Like it just blows up, and then media backlash and stuff like that. So the unfortunate part is that a hospital is usually a very violent place.
Yeah.
And we work very closely with patients. So if I'm talking about, say, just nurses as a whole first, nurses work in such an intimate range to be able to do so many different duties. And because they work with people that like no one is happy at the hospital. Everyone is upset in some way, varying levels of upset, but they all are ill in some way, whether it's mentally or physically. And so there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of conflict, and some people are going to be right off the rocker, whether it's mentally or because of drugs or they're in intense pain. And so it's a very dangerous range that they work in all the time. And they have no training on how to actually keep themselves safe. And without even any fault of their own, they got into healthcare to care for people. And so it's not their fault that they don't have like this mindset to want to think about conflict and how to actually be effective, like in combat. And so you got, say, a female dominated workforce where they want to care for patients, and violence is unfortunately part of the job. And the organizations don't do a lot to teach them anything. There's time spent with some communication skills and stuff like that, because that is always taking place. But when we start talking about use of force in healthcare, everyone just goes, no, you're, as a nurse or a doctor, you don't use force.
Yeah.
But they do. It's not use of force in the sense of like striking patients and doing like intense takedowns. Sometimes takedowns do happen, unfortunately, but even having to hold down a 86-year-old woman that is dealing with dementia and she's very violent, if she soils herself in the bed, we don't have the option of just leaving her like that. We have to take care of her. And so what I was finding is that even though nurses aren't trained for this stuff, they still find a way to get the job done. And sometimes it's not the prettiest, and sometimes they unfortunately get hurt. Sometimes patients even unfortunately got hurt. So it's like the organization is turning a blind eye and being like, don't use force. But realistically, you guys are all having to use force to keep yourselves safe. So what I wanted to do is create an online video course that teaches concepts of distance management and positioning and frames and levers and stuff like that, so that they can start to have an understanding of how to carry out even their day-to-day duties as these healthcare professionals, to be able to keep themselves safe and also keep the patient safe as much as possible. Now, there's some circumstances where, like, if your life is in danger at the hospital, you have to actually defend yourself. And there have been instances where nurses or doctors or security have had to strike patients, and that sucks, but you have to do it. But for the most part, a lot of the stuff is just going to be like, how do you just control, like, how can you control this elderly patient from being able to bite, scratch you, throw things at you, and be able to do like your basic duties? How do you approach people? How do you talk to them? Basic body language. So stuff that's not like the I think like the self-defense stuff usually gets very a bad rep, especially in healthcare, because it's like, oh, it's either you or me, kind of like this adage where it's like you got to defend yourself. It's their life or your life. And it's like, well, no, it's not that, especially in healthcare. So it's like you got to care for them, but you got to be able to control them and be able to protect yourself. And so that's like the goal, is to give them the ability to be able to look out for themselves and be able to control their patient, minimizing risk for everybody.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I've had like psych nurses throughout the years, and it's like they're just some of the stories they tell. It's like, what the hell? It's something I always like. Not specific to nursing. It's like I've had bus drivers when the bus drivers were getting attacked a lot. Like, oh, what do I do? And I'm like, okay, what's your company's policy? And when you ask that
Yeah,
question, they always give you crickets. I'm like, because I can teach you stuff, you might get fired for it. Like, I need to work with what you got. And
exactly.
there's just that no one ever wants to talk about it in a meaningful way so that I can actually teach them something that's useful. And then, a lawyer gets the whole, no, we can't bring a Krav guy. Like, how dare you? Like, you don't even know what I'm going to teach. Like,
Yep. Yeah, there's been some companies that I've been reaching out to. It's tough with COVID because I can't go in and talk to people, and I can't do something like, say, free seminars, where like that's what I will do when this is over, where it's like I'll go to hospitals and different like care homes and stuff and be like, hey, let me give you guys a seminar so you can see my approach to this, because I promise you it's nothing like you've seen before or what you think this is. Because right now when I email a hospital and I'll talk to their like violence prevention team, and I'll be like, hey guys, like I'm going to give you free access to this course. Check it out.
Yeah.
That's all I want you to do. Just watch it, because I'm sure you guys will be like, holy shit, this is pretty cool. Like I'm pretty damn proud of what I've done, what I've made here. But I'll still have people be like, no, I'm not interested. And it's like, holy, you could watch this for free. It costs you nothing but a little bit of time. You're part of the violence prevention team. There is violence, but because I'm talking about, say, and it's something that I fought with the idea of like what I was naming it, but I wanted to call it control strategies and self-defense, because it's like it is those things. But self-defense has a bad rep in a lot of things. So I mean, self-defense in general, as soon as I hear that term, I'm like, it's probably garbage.
Yeah.
And then control strategies, control of a patient might seem a little too aggressive.
Yeah.
Like we had Vancouver Island Health Authority spent a ton of money to change their organization's name to Island Health, because having the word authority in their name, they felt like that just was not conducive to a healthcare environment. It's like,
well, there's sure
we become so scared of these trigger words. So like, there's also that where then people are like, oh, it's control strategies. I don't like that.
Yeah.
So then you get these crappy courses, which is why I didn't want to name it like somewhere where it's like, oh, you got like violence prevention and de-escalation. And it's like, I mean, there is force being used in this, and people are used to like seeing these courses called this stuff, or some versions of this every year. There's a new name for it. And it's crap in the sense where it's like you get a little bit of communication skills, and then you're not taught anything of how to actually defend yourself, how to disengage from like an aggressive patient, how to be able to work with a patient that's uncooperative, whether it's passively resisting or actively resisting. And so then it just becomes like don't use force. And it's like, but your staff are using force on a regular basis, not aggressively, in a very like nurturing manner to try and get the job done on these patients they care about. But that still means holding their wrist a bit tightly and pushing it into the bed so that grandma can't strike or scratch them while they have to try and administer an injection of medication or whatever. Like there's so many things, changing and cleaning up patients who have soiled themselves in bed with their diapers. It's like, that was like the hardest thing, because it takes a whole bunch of people. And when you got someone fighting the whole time, trying to hurt you, and at no fault of their own, they're in this state of like dementia where they think that we're there harming them and we're a bunch of strangers. It's a really sad environment. And it shouldn't be seen as like we're using force and it's putting people at risk. It's like, no, we have to find a way to be able to do this in a more controlled manner, because what we're doing right now is not working. Like we can skate by and make it work to a certain extent, which is kind of like what we talked about with the law enforcement stuff, where it's like, there's not enough issue yet that hospitals have been radically changing the approach or the training. But nurses do still get hurt way too often. And occasionally a patient gets hurt. And until something horrible happens, or more consistently starts happening, we're not going to see a big shift. Like say right now, what we're starting to see with RC, or not just RCMP, but like police in general, because of these last few cases, like we talked about with George Floyd, unfortunately, where it's like, oh yeah, there's becoming a lot more media attention to this. We need to change our approach.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to figure. Whether it changes in a good direction or in a bad direction, like we talked about some of the ways that it's going in a bad direction. Unfortunately, it's people don't want to spend money higher up until it really starts to cost them down below.
Yeah, I mean, for me,
reactionary.
One bottom line is more consistent training, and I think that we across the board, policing or nursing or whatever, it's just we need to be honest about the violent nature of humanity, and that use of force is difficult and hard, and you need to put in the time. But I think a lot of people just don't want to have that discussion, like the hospitals. Oh no, we're here for healthcare. It's like, yes, but let's talk about St. Paul's Hospital, shall we? No, we don't want to talk about that, where all the drug addicts go and cause a ruckus, or like, a lot of these police officers that are in high crime areas. And I'm not talking about the whole war on drugs nonsense. Oh, they're busting these guys for weed, which they do need to stop. I'm talking about these are like violent neighborhoods where they run into this problem. What do you want them to do? Just not be there anymore? And whenever they disappear, it's they're like, no, come back, because then the gangs just take over. And it's like no one wants to have these honest conversations. And how you have them, I'm not sure. Without somebody's gonna get pissed off, but it's like, can we talk about like violence is violence? It's not comfortable. It's difficult. You need training. Like I don't know.
Whereas I mean, in a sick way, satisfied to see that police-free section Chaz or whatever it was called in Seattle, that it went downhill. Like obviously I don't want to ever see people go through pain or death or anything like that, but from a certain point where it's like they have this idea of to defund the police and we want police-free zones, and it's like, look what happened. Spikes in crime rate, people died, people got I think there was a report of a rape or sexual assault. Stuff was getting stolen. Like a lot of bad stuff started to happen. It's like there are some shitty police officers, and that causes problems, but there are so many good officers out there. And the reason why we have police officers is because we have learned that people suck, and we need to be regulated.
Well, this is I don't want to go down the whole COVID rabbit hole, but I find the illogical nature of application of ideas and morals across, here I'm going to apply it, but here I'm not. So like facts and data. Well, let's look at facts and data for like gun crime in Canada. The current gun grab by the government is like, it's not based in reality. Or just application. These politicians want to push policies like defund the police. It's like, what do you think is going to happen? And they're just pushing these ideas for votes or for whatever. And it's just like, if we're not going to apply facts and data across the board and have realistic conversations, what's the fucking point? And like, why should I listen to you on this area if you're not going to listen to me on that area? And it's just everyone wants to win, basically, and nobody's having good middle of the road conversations about
everything's complete, like the false dichotomy of it's either left wing or right wing, and there's no such thing as being in the middle. And if you have a leftish kind of idea of one area, then it's not okay for you to have more of a right side idea when it comes to another area. It just becomes like the political divide right now, and it's shut down the two-way communication to have these ideas expressed, and to not be able to do so without just being immediately labeled something horrific. Or I mean, there's so many things. I've given up trying to talk to a lot of people. That's why I like jiu-jitsu. I just practice jiu-jitsu. It's a lot of fun.
I can't do that. I'm all about the politics. It drives people nuts, but it's like to me, the way to me, self-defense is so much more than the techniques. It's like, listen, when you look at history, like as a Jew, I'm like, I need to know when to run. And if I'm not paying attention to the political, and a lot of Jews will be like, that's paranoia. I'm like, is it though? Like, I'm feeling very uncomfortable, not as a Jew, actually. I have no problems in Vancouver with that, but just I'm feeling very uncomfortable in the world right now where, it feels like it's pre-World War I. The tensions are so high, but in order for that to make any sense, you have to know history. And I'm like, I think America's going to split up. What's going on with this whole China thing? Can we stop just shitting on Russia? Yes, they're trolls, but like why are we, like, what are you guys doing? And then it's just like, I'm just like, learn martial arts and get guns because I don't trust any of you anymore. Like, that's where I'm at. And, you know, I'm just like, I hope things go well because, you know, children are probably in the future and I don't want to have a shitty world for them. But it's like, I don't know what to do if no one wants to have a rational conversation anymore.
That's why my wife and I have a bunch of cats. Just like
Yeah.
not gonna bring any kids into this
One of
crappy
those
world. We
cats.
don't like babies anyway. So cats, those are my children. Happy with that. I like just doing jujitsu, hanging out with my jujitsu guys because similar lifestyles. There's still different opinions and stuff like that, but most of the time we're just there to train jujitsu. So it's like, yeah, we can be friends and training partners, even though we have different people that we support politically and different ideas on whether it's COVID or other things. Yeah, people just can't really, they can't be as friendly anymore when we have these different ideas. It's much more aggressive lately.
So much for the internet and social media unifying. I'm so
Yeah.
happy
So
about
then this will be tying in more to once again, like if we're talking about self-defense and like the idea of communication and being able to have these proper lines of dialogue, whether it's actual like learning how to debate and being able to do that in a way that's more professional in a sense, or like you're not actually just attacking each other and resorting to logical fallacies, but just how you treat people. And once again, because now we have fights as there already have been where people are now getting into fights at different rallies and protests and stuff like that, because now instead of just being able to walk past some people that are protesting, we have to now go up and confront them on their views. And instead of opening up an actual line of discourse where we're looking to try and actually have a debate and possibly change each other's point of view or change people listening, we're doing it just to antagonize, just to
Don't argue on
insult.
the internet. That's not a good idea.
Yeah, and it's just like, man, we're getting further away from treating people kindly and being able to have decent conversations. So it's
Well,
probably even more important to be training self-defense.
yeah, oh yeah. Like I'm sure you see my feed. I post like I'm pretty aggressive with my stances on stuff, but I will not engage with people that I don't know. I can't have a reasonable conversation. And there's people that I know I'm like, I'm not talking to you because we're never gonna agree and you're not even trying to meet in the middle. And there's other people I'm like, you're an idiot. I'm not talking to you.
I
So,
used to do stuff like that a long time ago, but for like Facebook or depending on like the social media platform you're using, like I guess for me, I never tried to change someone's point of view because I didn't think that would be
oh,
possible.
I don't.
But it's a public spectator sport in the sense that I'm doing it so that people can either see how foolish this person is or maybe sway somebody else's opinion.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Like I put a lot of stuff out there. I put it out there knowing it's like aggressive, but I'm like, I know that a lot of the people have never heard this perspective or never heard this idea, or they've been fed one thing only, and I just like to put it out there and fuel hopefully a discussion. But if you know, we'll see.
I used to do that with religion. I would just attack bad things that have happened in religion and stuff like that. And it's like, obviously, those debates are not useful. I'm not going to be changing anybody's mind with that kind of stuff. That was just when I was young and I just wanted to. Well, I still believe all the different arguments and stuff that I had back then. It's just like, I don't care unless like I see a religious person actually doing something that I don't agree with, like say like fighting against rights for homosexuals, where then it's like, okay, now you're actually affecting somebody else. But if somebody's actually religious and that's what they believe in, then it's like, that's fine, because you can be a good person regardless of the like religion that you believe in or don't believe in. You can be a good person or a shitty person.
Yeah, I think that's pretty universal. So I think we covered fair amount of stuff. Is there
and some different tangents and whatnot?
That's I can't stay focused for sure. Yeah. Anything you want to discuss we missed or things you want to throw out there?
No, I think, what has this been, like 2 hours now? It's been good conversation.
That's a medium short one to me. I just didn't sleep very much last night, so I'm pretty fatigued already. But
I was playing Call of Duty and then I got your invite and I was like, oh shit, I forgot. So now I'm gonna go back to leveling up one of the guns I'm working on.
But how can people find you online? Because you have all the websites and your courses.
Yeah, so my little online brand is RVV BJJ, and so that's my YouTube channel. I do have Facebook and Instagram, but I certainly don't do as much with that. The YouTube is the thing I take seriously. I have the healthcare control strategies and self-defense. If you're interested in checking out some of the free videos on that, if you work within healthcare, I'd highly recommend it. I work with my instructor, Rob Biernacki, on bjjconcepts.net. So that's purely for like sport oriented jiu-jitsu, if you're interested in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and a conceptual approach to it, then
Don't forget to
check that out.
Sweeps.
Yeah. Rob's got interesting ways of naming stuff that does hold for memory. People do not forget when we're talking about just like dick push. You're basically stepping on the other person's dick and you're pushing up on it. No one forgets that at that point. So
I actually used the triangle defense against a really tall, lanky, strong guy the other day. I just got my arm in, pushed up, couldn't finish it. I'm like, yeah. It was good. But thanks for coming on, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope we can train again some point in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're listening to The Warriors Day. Brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga. Turning lambs into lions.